Hello guys, this is a presentation for my consciousness class. So one of the hardest problems out there is trying to understand what consciousness is, what sorts of systems or animals, humans do we have consciousness. And this is especially relevant because people are trying to create artificial intelligence these days and they want to know if what they're creating is conscious, should we give it moral consideration, etc. So one way to conceptualize this problem is what Dave Chalmers in 1995 called the easy versus the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problem is, well, it's not really easy, but it's basically mapping out the physical brain and seeing what parts of it co-vary with our experience of things. So this can be done by science, by observing the brain, right? Whereas the hard problem is a bit harder to tackle because it's what Daniel Dennett called the subjective, private, ineffable experience. Like we have a very tough time communicating our own personal experience to people. So this is the hard problem. Like how do you study this with science, right? You can't really get inside somebody's head and see what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, so on. Now this hard problem, the best conceptualization of this problem and what it's built off of is Thomas Nagel's 1974 paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? So Nagel showed the problem that in order to understand somebody's experience, you have to get closer and closer to their point of view of things. And you can't really get there. Like, you can get close to it. Like, I can ask you, what is your experience of things, whatever. But ultimately, to get a really objective case for what you're experiencing, I would literally have to be inside your head. Something we can't really do, or at least not yet, right? So this makes me think that this is not just an ontological problem about the nature of things. This is an epistemological problem. Like, how do we know things, right? So I think this paper, this 1974 paper, was very prescient. It kind of set the trajectory for all further analyses of consciousness. And I'm going to build on this paper. So one trap I have to be careful not to fall into is Chalmers laid this out. So a lot of papers, when they try to tackle the problem of consciousness, they say they're going to tackle the hard problem, but by the end of the paper, they devolve into just describing brain states. And this is like we mentioned, is the easy problem. We're trying to explain the hard problem of consciousness. So, and one more thing I want to lay out here is Levine called this the explanatory gap. It's like, how do you go from describing physical brain states to describing the experience of things? We can call this subjective experience we all have. We can call it phenomenal experience or qualia. How do we get from this soggy gray brain matter to this kind of an experience? We can call this the explanatory gap. So I'm going to propose that we start with George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's analysis of cognition. They said that most of our cognition is based off of metaphors, metaphorical thinking. We usually think of something in terms of something else. And they've shown, like, I read the book, I think it was in 1980 they brought it out. It has hundreds of these metaphors. For example, let me just give some examples here. So when we think of ideas, we can think of ideas as products, as plants, or as resources. And just to give some examples they use in the book, we say his ideas have finally come to fruition. Like, we don't even recognize it in everyday life, but when we say this, we're actually invoking the metaphor of plants. It came to fruition, right? Or when you say we've generated a lot of ideas this week, you're invoking the metaphor of production. We've generated a lot of ideas this week. Another one is we've used up all our ideas. The metaphor we're using there is ideas as resources or commodities or something, like we've used them up. We don't recognize these metaphors we invoke like every day in our daily language. And I think this gives us a clue as to even our phenomenal experience. But I'll come to this. So what is this kind of a metaphor built out of? So there are, for Lakoff and Johnson, these higher level metaphors are built off of simpler metaphors, which are ultimately grounded in our physical way of being in the world. For example, let's give a simpler metaphor like unknown is up and known is down. We don't even think about this, but let me give some examples where this takes place. So when we say that matter is up in the air or this matter is settled, we're actually invoking a physical metaphor here that things that we know, they're settled, they're on the ground, they're not going to move anymore, right? Whereas when we say this matter is up in the air, it's yet to be solved, that means this matter is kind of floating around, it's hard to catch, hard to get a hold of. What are we going to do with this idea, right? And this is grounded in our physical experience, because things that are up in the air are very hard to grab, whereas things that are on the ground are stationary, we can get a hold of them very easily, right? So these abstract metaphors are grounded in our physical experience of things ultimately, okay? A similar approach is used by Hofstadter in his idea that our abstract concepts are built of amalgamations of analogies, okay? So we think in terms of analogical things. So to give an example, let's say I have a concept of, I'm reaching into, let's say a kid is crying here because they didn't get their toy. And I'm thinking, oh shit, when I was 6 years old, somebody took the toy away from me. So now I'm interpreting the new situation in terms of another situation that I've had in my past. And Douglas Hofstadter would call these concepts. But okay, we won't go too far into this. Basically, the point I'm trying to make is that we usually think of things in terms of something else. And good terminology to use for this is, we have a source domain and a target domain. Okay, so if I'm trying to explain this abstract concept of up or up in the air to someone, that is the target domain that I'm trying to explain to somebody else. And the metaphors I use to explain it to someone else, we can call these a source domain. For example, when I think of up, I think of my finger pointing up at something, or I'll think of the sky, I'll think of the stars, things that are usually up. These would be the source domains that I use to explain the target domain, this abstract concept of up. Okay, so once we can accept this, even if you don't accept the whole package that everything we think about is metaphorically, even Lakoff and Johnson say there are other figurative, imaginative devices we use, like metonymy or whatever. But once you get this idea, let's bring this back. Like, what would be the ultimate source domain that makes up everything else? So like, if I think of the direction up in terms of a simpler metaphor, and I think of that metaphor in terms of something else, what is that beginning source domain in terms of which we think of everything else? To borrow a term from linguistics, we would call this the bootstrap. It's like, let's say a kid wants to pick up language. What enables them to do this? You need some ability there. And this term has been taken by computer programmers. It's like, if you want to teach a computer to pick up programming languages, you need to have like a very essential beginning language there to pick up the other languages. We call that the bootstrap, right? You can even apply this to evolution. I think this was in Steven Pinker's book, where he's explaining like, how is it that genes can make up the whole body? Well, you need a bootstrap there. You need something to initialize the whole process, right? So my proposition is that qualia, okay, this term has been used to describe the phenomenal subjective experience we all have. I'm going to use it in a kind of a different way. I'm going to say that qualia is that bootstrap that allows you to think of everything else in terms of this thing, okay? So, to give an example, let's say I have this can in front of me here. How do I know that this is a can, right? Well, basically, what my brain does is it represents the can in my brain with neurons, and it'll pick up the salient features, those features that are important to my survival. And we know it's only those features that are important to my survival through a couple of cases. So for example, there's a famous paper written on frogs. So frogs, if they have flies that are stationary, like dead flies around them, the frogs won't even be able to recognize these flies. They can only recognize flies when they're moving around, because that's what their brain catches. That's what it can represent to itself. So it's funny because you could have a frog surrounded by dead flies and it'll actually starve to death because it can't pick them up. It can only sense things that are flying around, and then it'll start out its tongue and eat them. Okay, that's because for the frog, the salient features that it had to recognize throughout its evolution in its environment are little things that were moving around that it could eat, right? In the same way, when I look at this can, the salient features might be, I have to know where I can grasp this can, where I can drink from it, stuff like that. But how does my brain represent this? Like, what are the fundamental things it uses? Well, I would say the qualia, like, let's say think of it like a pigment, like a paint, right? Like, that's the closest thing we have to describe it. Like, there's some kind of paint or something that the brain is using to see where this can is so I can represent it to myself, okay? So then the question becomes, what sort of substance or what sort of thing is this qualia that what I propose makes up the source domain to think of everything else in terms of this bootstrap. And I think here people fall into this pitfall is that they think qualia is this extra substance or entity that's floating around in the brain or something that they're trying to explain by observing the physical brain. I would propose this is a wrong way to think about it. And this is where Turginski wrote a paper in 2017. It has most of the ideas I'm mentioning here, and I'm just building off of them a little bit more. She said we should think about qualia as a process rather than an entity. So the way we think of it conventionally is like we have input stimuli. We can call it like A, box A. Then we have box C or somewhere over there that is like our mental experience of things. And then in between there's like this black box. We can call it box B. People think consciousness is somehow in box B there. It's like an entity that we're trying to explain that gives rise to our experience of things. But this is a wrong way of conceptualizing things, because if we think of consciousness or qualia or phenomenal experience as a process rather than an entity, it's not something that we have to look for in the physical brain. It's just something the brain uses to represent things to itself. Okay? So by thinking of it this way, you actually cut out the hard problem of consciousness, because then you don't need to explain phenomenal experience in terms of these neurons in the brain. It's just a process by which you represent other things to yourself. Okay? And a clue to this is when you think of your conscious experience, it's very transparent to you. You don't recognize features of this consciousness. You only recognize the features of things you're looking at. Okay? So the word we use for this, the word Turginski uses, is that consciousness is transparent. We have no way to see that consciousness. We're only seeing other things, and we kind of infer that we have a consciousness there that's an entity or something. So if consciousness is truly transparent, if we can accept this, then we cannot use it as grounds to think of what consciousness might look like. Okay? And this is the problem with people who've tackled the hard problem of consciousness, is that they think they have an idea of what it would look like based on their experience of things. But if our experience is truly transparent, we can only see the objects we're looking at and not the consciousness itself, because it's the bootstrap, it's the source domain, then we have no idea what consciousness looks like. So then we can use the principle of parsimony, which is you use the simplest explanation that you have a hold of. The simplest explanation is that there is no entity, and whatever co-varies with that experience is what's making up the phenomenal experience, which is the neurons in our brain. They represent everything that's happening around us. So, and this we know this, like Hubel and Wiesel, they found neurons in the brain that would correspond to things. Like, let's say a cat looks at a straight line, you can find neurons in the cat's brain that correspond to that straight line. And then there's hierarchical processing. So higher level brain regions will take the line that the cat observed or whatever, put it together with motion and other things, and then you have a full picture or whatever. But the neurons do represent the physical world. They're like an analog map for what's happening in reality. So I would say there's no need to think of a whole other substance that consciousness is. It's just the process of representing something in terms of something else. Okay, so again, people will have a problem with this, but because we think consciousness should look like something. But I think that's just because we have a predilection towards our own experience, and we think we know what consciousness looks like, but we actually don't. It's transparent to ourselves. This has huge implications. This means that any system that represents things, that has information in that way, does have a consciousness of the target domain. Okay, so even computers, whatever, they all have consciousness of things. Okay, it's just that they will never be able to know what they're thinking of other things in terms of. So for a computer, it might be bits like zeros and ones, and it's representing reality to itself through those zeros and ones. For us, it's neurons, whatever. And when you think of metaphors, even like when I try and think of up and I think of it in terms of the finger pointing at the sky, the moon, whatever, I don't question what makes up the moon or what makes up my finger until I make that the target domain. Okay, so whatever you're using to represent other things in terms of, that primary source domain becomes transparent to yourself. You're not thinking of it in terms of anything until you do. And with Qualia, you just can't, because it's the bootstrap. It's the first thing you think of everything else in terms of. That's why it's transparent to us. That's why we have not a clue what it looks like or whatever. Okay, so I would call this an epistemological problem, not an ontological problem. It's a problem of knowing. It's not a problem of what is the nature of that thing, because we just don't have a clue, right? So even if you studied the physical brain for years and years, whatever, neuroscience will study it for hundreds of years, they will never be able to bridge this explanatory gap, because they're using that bootstrap to think of everything else in terms of it, and that first bootstrap is transparent to themselves. They have nothing to represent it with. Okay, so this comes into interesting problems like the zombie problem. Like, could you have a zombie version of the human being that doesn't have phenomenal experience and still does all the behaviors that we do? Well, here we get into discussion of metaphysical necessity versus causal necessity. Metaphysical necessity implies that in every single world you could conceive of, that this would hold up. And I would say this version of Qualia that I've proposed is not metaphysically necessary. You could design a system that ran differently, that didn't need to represent other things in terms of a source domain. But it is causally necessary. Causally necessary because the way the humans are made up, the way we do the representation process, yes, we need Qualia as a process to represent other things in terms of. It's basically an awareness that we have of something because we're using something else to represent it to ourselves. In the brain, in the physical human brain would be the neurons that co-vary with the experience, right? We can use the simplest explanation. So this kind of answers the zombie problem, that no, you cannot have zombies that don't have phenomenal experience. And another problem that's been directed at representationalist theories, although mine really isn't, or maybe it is, I don't know. Anyways, one problem that's been directed to representational theories is the Qualia inversion problem. Like, could somebody be another human being there and have a different experience of red than I do? And I would say yes, they could, but it wouldn't matter as long as they're able to recognize the salient features in the environment that matter to them, that let them survive. So another theory that we can tie in to describe this is Donald Hoffman's idea that basically we're sensing reality through a graphical user interface, a GUI. The same thing that when we interact with the computer, we don't interact with the computer and see zeros and ones. We see something that's very amenable to us that we can interact with. So for example, if I want to delete a file, I can drag an icon into the recycling bin. It doesn't mean that in the computer something went into a recycling bin. That's just the way we represent it to ourselves, okay? It's a graphical user interface. In the same way, when we look at reality, we don't actually notice everything accurately. We only represent reality in terms of kind of something that, a way of representing that we already have to notice those features of the environment that matter to us. And we can demonstrate this is the case with all these optical illusions we see. Like, we're often inaccurate in the way we perceive, and we can be tricked in lab experiments. But this doesn't matter. What matters is that we survive, that we pick up the right things, right? So here we can introduce a distinction between Russellian representation and Phrygian representation. Russellian representation says that the things we're representing actually have those properties themselves. Like this, maybe this can is already green or something, and then we're just picking it up, representing it to ourselves. Phrygian representation says that we have a mode of representation in us already by which we are picking up the physical reality. Okay, so this approach uses Phrygian representation, not Russellian representation. One last thing I want to cover here is one problem people might have with thinking that every system is conscious that represents things is that it makes it seem like we don't want computers to be conscious. We don't want to give them moral worth. But here I would say we don't have to. Okay. Usually when we talk of consciousness, we load it with so many functions, like the ability to pick up pain or whatever. There's the higher order thoughts. There's the actual phenomenal experience. We just package in all these functions, and then we think like, holy shit, if this thing is conscious, then we need to give it moral consideration. But if you unpackage it, just because something is aware of something else doesn't mean it's deserving of moral consideration. It's only when you package in extra functions like it can experience pain or pleasure. It has a higher level thought, self-reflexive thoughts like I'm doing this, what we would call self-consciousness. Once we package all these things in, then we'll think, oh shit, maybe this thing should be recognized under the law and we should protect its rights and stuff, right? So just accepting that even computers are aware of their environment through something else whenever they use representation, whenever they simulate the environment to themselves, doesn't give it moral consideration. Okay, so I'll wrap up this presentation here. I've used a lot of Turginski's paper, and I'll cite it. I'll cite the extra things at the end of this presentation. So yeah, thanks guys.